Well, here's our interpretation of that old favorite, the drop leaf table. Now, this one is made from ash. I think baseball bats are made from. It's a nice hardwood and very durable. Now, if you look at it, it has some turned legs and a little device here that holds the leaves upright when it's being used. And this little drop leaf detail right here, which aligns the tops when they're up. Now, this one has been built like they've been building them for 200 years, with the possibility of one exception. This one is made from glued-up stock rather than single boards. Most of the pieces that we looked at had a severe cupping problem. In other words, the boards were curled. And that's because of uneven moisture absorption. They might have had a finish on the top, but none on the bottom. And the top might have received direct sunlight, but none underneath. So one of the ways to help minimize that cupping is to do the glue up. Now, when I do it, I like to pay attention to one very important thing, the growth rings. You alternate them. So this board, they're down. And this board, they're up. And that should help relieve some of those problems. Now, the other thing I pay attention to is the grain pattern. I want the board to look like one single piece. So I try to match it up so that it all blends together. Now, before I can glue the pieces up, I have to make sure the joint looks good. And on this one, you can see there's a little bit of space right here. So I'm going to plane it down on my joiner, which is just a tool with a heavy cast bed, about 3 feet long. And in it, there's a wheel that rotates at a relatively high speed with 3 cutters. Now, these cutters happen to be solid carbide, and I like those because they last a long time. Now, before I run the board through, I want to take a look at the grain. And you can see here, the grain is running down in this direction. And the rotation of the blade is always clockwise. If I run it through this way, it's going to chip out at these points. So I want to turn it around, making sure that the grain runs in this direction, and I'll get a perfectly smooth cut. Now I'm ready for some glue up. I just set the boards on my pipe clamps. I want to put a nice even coat of yellow glue right on the edge of the board. And this applicator does a great job at spreading it out. Now I just put enough pressure to bring the 2 boards together and just squeeze out a little bit of that glue. The parts of this table that seem a little formidable are these legs. I did need a lathe to do the turning, and I had to find some stock big enough to give me a 2-inch finished dimension up here at the top. I've milled the square stock and cut the pieces a little bit long. I'll do the final trimming after I do the turning. And the first thing I did was remove some material off the corners down in the area where the turning takes place. And that's going to save me a lot of time on the lathe. Now, over here at the bandsaw, I've tilted the table to 45 degrees. And since I don't want to run the piece all the way through, I've put a little pencil mark back here as a guide for a stopping point. Okay. Now I'll just clamp it in my bench. Use a back saw to cut off the little scraps. Over here I have a lathe set up to make copies. Okay, now that I'm within about 1/16 of an inch of my pattern, I'm going to speed up the lathe a little bit and make the final cuts. Now, by increasing the speed of the lathe a little bit more and using a variety of different grits of sandpaper, I'll smooth it all out. Well, I'm not quite finished with my leg yet. I have to cut a mortise because each rail fits into that leg, and later I'll peg it with some dowel stock. But first, to make the mortise, over on the drill press where I've set it up with a mortising attachment. And all this really is a square chisel into which a drill bit slides through. And as you press down, a hole gets drilled first, and then the chisel squares it off. And all the excess material will come up through this slot. Now, I've also set the depth of the drill press so that I end up with about a 3/4 inch deep mortise. So by making several plunges into the leg, I'll end up with a perfect mortise. Now the rails have tenons which fit into those mortises I've just made in the legs. And I'll make the tenons over on the table saw. And the first cut that I want to make is this shoulder cut right here. So I've set the blade to the right depth and added this block that's clamped to the fence. And the reason that's there is because whenever you use a T-square in combination with a rip fence, you tend to sometimes get some kickback from the boards. So this block gives me a gauge to align the piece with the blade, yet before I hit the blade, I end up with some clear space in here so I won't get that twisting or kickback. For the next operation, I've raised the blade, and what I want to do is make this shoulder cut right here. So without changing anything else, I'll make the first pass through and then nibble away the rest of the material. Finally, the cheek cut, which is right along this line here. Back at our prototype base for the table, the side stile and this swing arm are cut out of the same piece. And they're mitered at the ends here to act as a self-stop. The first thing I want to do is drill a hole for this screw right here. Now to make this cut right along the bottom of that support piece, I got a couple tricks for you. First of all, I don't want to use my standard saw blade because it has too wide of a kerf. It's going to remove too much material. So I found a blade that's a lot thinner, and it's still carbide tip, and in fact this blade comes out of my circular saw. Now, what I want to do is slide my piece in underneath this feather board, and what this does is it holds the piece down and it keeps it from kicking back. And I'm going to raise the blade up slowly through the wood, and then I can push it through to my final mark. Shut the saw down, lower the blade, and take the piece out. Now I'll bring the piece over to my bench and clamp it in the vise. I'm going to make this final cut. To do that, I'm going to use a back saw. This is just the right saw for this job because it has real fine teeth and it has a nice rigid blade which allows me to make real straight cuts. Now the idea of this swing arm is that it pivots on this screw and not get hung up, and I have a couple little tricks for that. The first thing is that I have to enlarge this pilot hole I drilled earlier so the screw will just sit in there freely. And to do that, I'm just going to use a larger bit in the drill. Okay, with that done, I'm going to turn it over and put a little countersink so that the head of the screw will be flush or slightly recessed. Now, if you set the piece in place, you notice that if it's pushed way down, it's not flush right here. It's a little bit too low. And it's hitting on the bottom, which means it'll constantly rub, and we see a lot of old tables that fail because of that. Now I'm going to slide it up, and I found that a little thin washer and one that's just a bit thicker is just the right amount to make it flush again. So all we have to do is stand it up, set our washers in place, swing arm in there, and we'll just drive a screw through there. Before I do any assembly of the base, I want to sand all the rails with my palm sander, which